Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Unmasking the Realities, Community, and Racial Healing. We would like to take the time to thank our community partner, and that would be the Center of Research and Learning, or I should say, I apologize. That will be the Truth and Racial Healing and Transformation Center at the University of Cincinnati. We would also like to take the opportunity to thank our generous sponsor, Gallagher Insurance, uh, with their generous contribution in making this series possible in this discussion this evening.
As your trusted insurance broker and trusted benefits and HR consultant, Gallagher is putting our values into practice when and where they matter most, through our actions and our partnerships, lending a hand and lending expertise by connecting those in need with the resources they need most and partnering with those who share our values to bring those values to life. Because these aren't just the places we do business. They're the places we call home, our communities. From day one, it's been our mission to help you face the future with confidence. And even in the toughest times, we're confident that the future is bright. And it's only made brighter when we face it together.
Please note that this is not the first of the Unmasking the Realities conversations, and we still have more to come. So we certainly would like for you to join us for our next Unmasking the Realities conversation, scheduled for November 18th, 2021 at 3 p.m. The topic is unconscious and conscious bias in urban planning. More details about the registration and more will be shared at freedomcenter.org in the coming weeks. So please stay connected with us as we continue to be the convener of meaningful discussions. My name is Christopher Miller. I am the Senior Director of Education and Community Engagement here at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. And as I stated before, I want to thank our community partner, as well as our sponsor, Gallagher Insurance, for their generosity in helping to support this meaningful series that we have here today. We are in trying times, difficult times while we navigate through our communities, trying to be of service to our community while doing our best to unify and embrace the spirit of humanity, as well as to heal along racial lines. And so we're excited to have this conversation. There will be a portion where you will be able to post comments and questions in the chat. I ask that you be respectful of our panel, respectful of this conversation, and be engaged in the conversation that we will be having here tonight. So at this time, I would like to introduce our outstanding panel. First, we have Catherine Duffy. Catherine is a member of the Becoming Beloved Community Leadership Team and the Diocese of Southern Ohio, and focuses on the link between racial justice and the environment. She is the convener of the Creation Care Network of Province V of the Episcopal Church, and the co-chair of the Creation Care and the Environmental Justice Task Force in her diocese. Thank you for joining us, Catherine. We also have joining us Larry James. He is a co-convener of the Becoming Beloved Community Leadership Team for the Episcopal Diocese of Southern Ohio. He serves as the COO of James River Holdings, LLC, and the president and principal consultant of Cultural Drivers, a national multicultural marketing optimization firm. Thank you for joining us, Larry. And then we also have joining us Dr. Kyra Shahid. She is an assistant director with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Center of Research on Learning and Teaching at the University of Michigan. Dr. Shahid is also the founder and principal consultant of Shahid Consulting LLC, Dr. Shahid earned her PhD in educational leadership with a focus on the intersections of race, spirituality, and leadership in higher education, and an MS in student affairs in higher education from Miami University of Ohio. She is also a proud graduate of Central State University, where she received her BA in broadcast communications. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Shahid. And we also have Dr. Tyra Sheree Gaynor. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, founding director of our community partner, the Center for Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, and Taft Professor of Social Justice at the University of Cincinnati. Her research focuses on the unjust experiences that individuals at the intersection of race, gender, identity, and sexual orientation have when interacting with systemic racism and social hierarchy in public administration. She holds a PhD and MPA from the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers University. She also received a BA in psychology from Rutgers University in New Brunswick. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Gaynor. And lastly, our moderator for the evening is Kevin Aldridge. Kevin is an award-winning journalist with more than 20 years of experience in news media. He is the opinion and engagement editor at the Cincinnati Enquirer. He is the senior pastor at Grace AME Church in Bellefontaine, Ohio, and youth pastor at Allen Temple at AME Church in Cincinnati. He is a very, very busy man, and we're glad to have him this evening to moderate this outstanding panel. And so without further ado, I will hand things over to our panel for this evening's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm excited to be moderating this important and timely discussion for us this evening, and grateful to have all of our great panelists on board, and excited to hear your views. So we won't waste any time. We'll get right into our conversation for this evening. And I'd like to toss the first question out to the group, but I'd ask Dr. Gaynor to kind of get us started by telling me, how do you describe racial healing? And what is its purpose?
Yeah, so happy to be here and so happy to be on this panel with such amazing people and colleagues. When I think about racial healing, I'm thinking about an intentional and concerted effort to work against the harm that's caused by racism. And when I talk about racism, I'm talking about a belief system that is hierarchical and puts value on humans, right? On human bodies. And so in my opinion, racial healing is the foundation, it's the beginning, right? And so it's the first step in an ongoing process of investigating, of introspection, of learning, educating, acknowledging, changing, and ultimately engaging in consistent activity to work against racism and work against white supremacy. And so it requires us to tell truth. It requires us to tell truth of our lived experiences, of others' lived experiences. It requires us to speak truthfully about history, about systemic racism, about how the institutions that we find ourselves engaging with, maybe even working with, are rooted in white supremacy, and how they operate to maintain this hierarchy of human value, right? But in terms of its purpose, it can advance political will, it can help build public sentiment. And why these things are important just within a local context, and thinking about Ohio, when it comes to equality for employment and wealth, Ohio ranks 45 out of 50. Ohio loses $40 billion in its GDP due to racial inequality. Hamilton County, where Cincinnati resides, loses almost $10 billion in its GDP towards racial inequality. Cincinnati has one of the highest infant mortality rates for Black children, while housing one of the best children's hospitals in the nation, right? And so these data demonstrate why racial healing is critical and why it's an immediate imperative.
Thank you, Dr. Gaynor. Larry, I want to toss it to you and get your perspective on the same question. Dr. Gaynor laid it out there very nicely. How do you see racial healing, and what is its purpose? And how do we get? She talked a lot about the need to be truthful and honest, but how do you deal with that when there are still those who feel like we've sort of advanced in society, we've gotten past some of these some of our dirtier parts of our racial history, and sort of feel like we've moved on, and some of these things are not necessarily race based. How do you fight against that sort of thing?
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks to the the Freedom Center for inviting me to be on this esteemed panel. I'm very happy to be here with my esteemed colleagues that are across the screen for me. I guess I would agree 100% with what Dr. Gaynor has put forward. I don't want to take too much time, but because most of what we're going to say is going to be complimentary of what other people are saying. But to me, racial healing is kind of the process of making well or repairing the physical, mental, emotional, and fiscal damage that the sickness of sin and racism in America has done. And what it has done is it has negatively impacted and often destroyed lives of the underprivileged non-white, meaning Black, brown, and other people of color. Dr. Gaynor is so correct in talking about how it starts with truth, and it's incredibly important, especially in this day and age where truth is at a premium in our political spectrum and throughout our communities. Truth is being stretched, denied, and sometimes even omitted. Truth, it really is found in the naked realities of American history. I think the first thing that we need to do is agree as a nation that we're going to examine more critically our American history and tell it the way it is, not sugarcoating it, not making it so I guess I want to say so story-like or movie-like, if you will, but it's real. It happened and it affects all of us. And so if we can get together as a nation to really pursue truth as it pertains to our American history and what it has created for us in this day and age, I think we'll be in a good step, having a good step forward.
Dr. Shaheed, I'd like to throw this next question to you. Is we know the importance of conversation, of communication in trying to bring about racial healing in our country. How important is it that these conversations be diverse conversations and not just like groups talking to one another about the same issues? In order for racial healing to be genuinely successful, does diversity have to be a part of these conversations?
I think my answer would be yes and no, right? I think we've got to be strategic about when and where we are talking within groups and across groups. I think there is a need, a necessary need to make sure that there are particular spaces that are available, especially affinity spaces when we're talking about processes of healing, because that healing has to take place on a multitude of different levels. But as we are thinking about what we do as a response to the healing, how do we fully engage and make spaces more equitable? How do we really engage in a process of transformation? That's when we really need to lean on one another. And so being able to be discerning about when and where we are having conversations that are far more collaborative and that are far more diverse in terms of the types of voices and the different spaces where healing needs to take place, where those conversations happen in a process of racial healing is significant and important, so that we don't redo past injustices in the name of being diverse, right? And so that we recognize the many ways in which many voices have been silenced or concretized as the diverse voice, as opposed to the global majority, right? And so how we enter into those conversations, where we are considerate of where we are talking about diversity in terms of who speaks, also speaks to the ways in which our commitment to racial healing is legible, and ways that we don't weaponize diversity against ourselves, right? To say, well, we can't go further because we need to make sure it looks a particular way, or that we have a particular array of voices that are present, when there are going to be moments, and there ought to be moments in this process of healing, where certain voices need to speak first, certain voices need to be heard and speak louder, and certain voices who haven't had the opportunity to speak need to have particular space, so that the truth of what they are saying, right, can be made accessible, so that as we are engaging in conversations further, they can be, there's the possibility of them being far more equitable than starting out as if we're all on a vocal, playing field that's even. So knowing that that's not true, I think my answer to that question is complicated. I think when and where we enter diversity into the conversation is just as significant as acknowledging that those conversations ought to be diverse and collaborative.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think what you just laid out illustrates just the complexity of the conversations that we're having tonight, because you're right, there is a strategy to how we have to have these conversations. Catherine, what's your view on that, and what do you think about the importance of diversity in conversations and some of the points that Dr. Shahid just made?
Well, first, thank you also for including me in this conversation. It's an honor to be here with Dr. Shahid and Dr. Gaynor, and you, Kevin, and Christopher, and my friend and colleague, Larry. And Dr. Shahid, I really appreciate your perspective. I think it's one that needs to be heard. Your point that there are voices that need to be lifted up and need to be lifted up louder, that haven't been heard in the past, is a really critical one. And said another way, there are spaces that are not safe for all voices to be heard. And I think that telling that particular truth and acknowledging and accepting that particular truth is a critical one for white people, because I think I can't speak for all white people, but I can speak for myself and the ones I know well, to say that that's a hard truth for us to admit, to think that sometimes our presence, just by its nature, does things to make people uncomfortable, and acknowledging that there's places and spaces where we are not, where our presence doesn't serve the dialogue. It's a really important truth to acknowledge, and I appreciate Dr. Shahid, you lifting it up for us.
Can I just build on this question a little bit, Kevin?
Absolutely, jump right in there.
Yeah, so I appreciate Catherine's comments, and just wanted to build on this a little bit because I'm a social justice researcher. I do community-based work. And so one of the things that I often find in engaging in conversations around racial healing or social justice is there is this idea or mentality that this is the work of people who are marginalized and oppressed, right? This is the work of people of color. And, I want to be very explicit in this space to articulate that the issues that people of color, the issues that marginalized populations deal with, they did not create those issues for themselves. And so they should not be solely responsible with figuring out the solutions. And then, facilitating racial healing circles, I have, heard white people articulate that they don't know how to arrive in these spaces, or they don't understand where their role is. And so I want to be very clear that, this process is an all hands on deck process. You can have all the folks of color in the country come together, but unless we have fundamental shifts at the policy level, systemic shifts, institutional shifts, then things will maintain the way that they are. Oppression will continue. And so I wanted to be, I really wanted to call that into that space, because this is not the work or solely the work of people of color, and white people and people with all kinds of privileges very much need to be a part of this, and they very much need to engage in conversations with their neighbors, with their family members, because that's ultimately how change can occur.
So to build on that, Dr. Gaynor, you talk about the need for policy change, the changes to systems. How much more is the conversation complicated by our polarization right now in the country and this notion of identity politics that that you so often hear about from certain folks in the political sphere? How do you overcome that to achieve racial healing in this current hyper polarized political climate that we're in, to try to get the type of systemic change that you say is necessary to bring about healing?
Right. That's a really great question. And I recognize the space, the political environment in which we find ourselves in, right? I mean, the Ohio State Legislature has crafted two House bills, House Bill 322 and House Bill 327, that are considered divisive concepts bill, right? And these bills will prevent K through 12 educators in higher education, and institutions that receive state funding from engaging in conversations around racial discrimination, racial inequity, gender inequity, the history, right? The truth. These bills would fundamentally undermine these conversations. I mean, quite frankly, if these bills pass, I might not have a job, right? But the way that I approach these conversations I am approaching conversations with people who are willing to have conversations. They don't have to be people who have it all figured out, but they're willing to engage in a conversation. They're willing to hear. My belief is that I hope to connect with the people who want to have conversations, so that the folks who aren't willing to hear it, the folks who are suggesting that we don't need to teach race in our school system or in higher education, become the people who are at the margins. They become the outliers. If we have enough people who are willing to be open and who are willing to learn, then I think we can begin to change the tide. We can begin to shift the tide.
Thank you. And that provides a great transition to this next question I wanted to talk about. And I wanted to pose this one to Dr. Shaheed. You brought up the bills and the effect of teaching history, teaching Black history, and what some would say is the correct versions of American history. I know for myself personally that I didn't learn a lot of Black history until I got to college myself. I didn't, you learned about most of the usual suspects, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X was big because Spike Lee's movie had just come out when I was around high school. And so that was a topic of conversation. But outside of that, not really a lot of Black history taught in my elementary and high school years. And it wasn't until I got to college that I really broadened my understanding and perspective of my own history. Dr. Shaheed, how important is higher education in the discussion that we're having today about bringing about racial healing?
It's a loaded question for a number of reasons, right? Because when people hear higher education, they're going to think institution of higher education. And I like to use that term in several ways, right? That you can achieve and engage in higher education without being a part of these predominantly white, historically white institutions of higher learning. But to answer the question in the way in the spirit of what I think you meant it, I think higher education is incredibly essential because of what you just outlined, right? Our students across this country, and I would, argue globally, are not exposed to the practice of critical engagement of difference, and they're not exposed to enough creative knowledge content where they are able to engage in critical conversations and to reimagine and to rethink what change looks like. Everything has been standardized. Creativity has been stockpiled and sold back to us. And what we have become accustomed to and what we know as the process of schooling is, epistemically violent, and that's part of what my research has been about is, the ways in which knowledge is constructed as truth and as a singular truth. And as human beings, we tend to believe the first version of a story that we hear, right? So if you were taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America, everything else that you're hearing brushes up against what you know to be true. Even as you undo that truth, you are undoing that truth, right? And so I think there's a lot of work and a lot of onus and responsibility on institutions of higher education to make sure that folks have exposure to literature, exposure to scholars, exposure to language that gives them tools to practice creativity, right? A lot of the reasons why many of the students that I've engaged with, they'll say, Dr. Kyra, the only way we're going to end racism is everybody dies and we start all over. And it happens every year, right? And part of why they say that is because they have not had enough time or enough space or the tools to properly create and imagine the possibility to create something new. All they know is what has existed, and they don't think that it can ever go away. So even though we talk about race being a social construct, and several things being socially constructed and they can be socially deconstructed, their faith in that process is limited by what they have had exposure to and what they've had the capacity to practice. And so I think higher education becomes incredibly essential for developing those tools, developing the tools to not only engage in conversation, but to be able to engage in dialogue and debate, which is a lost art, especially amongst college students. So getting them into spaces where they engage in truth telling, where they are hearing multiple narratives, and multiple perspectives so that they can come to new understandings is incredibly essential. And that's the beauty of, the institutions as they exist now. And that's also the opportunity, if we are able to focus our efforts on equity-focused teaching and learning and strategic engagement, so that folks are not just plug and play with, this is what you need to know in order to gain this job, or this is what you need to know in order to pass the GRE, or whatever it is. It's not just knowledge to get you to a point that already exists, but knowledge that develops your capacity to reimagine what's possible. That's the importance of higher education, and that's the need that we have. That's also the opportunity if we leverage our resources correctly.
A lot of great points there, and you're right. It is very difficult to unlearn what you've learned and sort of open your mind to information that may be new to you, and gives you a fuller picture of exactly what you're looking at. Great points. So I want to now kind of bring Catherine and Larry back into the conversation here, and I want to talk a little bit about becoming the beloved community and also creation care. And so Larry, if you might take a few minutes to just kind of talk about what is becoming beloved community and what is it seeking to accomplish. And then Catherine, when Larry gets done, you can talk about creation care and why it is a part of becoming a beloved community. So Larry, I'll give you a few minutes to talk about that.
I'm acting like a Zoom novice. Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to share with you a number of different definitions of becoming a beloved community as it pertains to the Episcopal Church. And I do that because there are so many that are similar, and we usually put out a number of different definitions to find that one that resonates with each individual person. But to start off with, becoming a beloved community is the adopted expression of that the Episcopal Church has laid onto its strategic imperative or long-term commitment to racial justice, healing and reconciliation, and better care for our planet, as well as evangelistically proclaiming the good news by seeking and naming and celebrating the loving presence of Jesus in the stories of all people, and inviting people to bring their own stories. It's a spiritual movement within the church through which all people can grow to love God and love the image of God that we find in our neighbors, ourselves, and in creation. It defines a process that takes us down a strategic path. Now, this is more specific what we do with becoming beloved community. Takes us down a strategic path through 4 distinct phases that lead to personal and structural transformation. And those phases are, number 1, Dr. Gaynor brought this up, telling the truth. The truth about the harm that our church has done and continues to do so that we may heal together. Becoming beloved community is the act of looking inside of our organization and understanding what our role has been through the annals of history and today. Proclaiming the dream is the second phase, and which is talking about changing the conversation to go deeper while embracing conflict and opportunities for growth and transformation for all of us. The third phase is practicing the way of love. We're moving beyond a helping model to realize more authentic relationships between us. And then finally, repairing the breach, which is very closely related to racial healing. Finding more effectively examining whiteness as a strategy to dismantle white supremacy using both political action and advocacy. But to wrap all this up into something I find resonates with me, it's the practical image of the world that we pray for when we say these things. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And when we boil it down to that, we know that everybody who's a Christian says that. The question is, do you say it and go out of the church doors and do something entirely different? And so that's what we're trying to do within the Episcopal Church and outside of the Episcopal Church with all of those who wish to partner with us.
Catherine, go ahead. If you'd like to talk about creation care.
Yeah, I would actually. I'll just pick up where Larry left off, because I think your question was, why do we talk about creation care as part of the Becoming Beloved Community movement? But I think the place to start really is, why do Christians care about creation care? And I think of it in 2 ways. Simply, one, in the beginning of our sacred text, the first peoples that God created were given this earth that God made. So God is embodied on the earth for people to be in relationship with, to care for, to steward as representatives of God on the earth. We've had a special relationship with the earth forever, and God has asked us to care for it. So it's right there. It's just like page 1 stuff, right? But then if you fast forward to the New Testament and as followers of Jesus at a very simple level, Jesus calls us to love other people as we ourselves are loved by him and by God. And there is no way that we can say that the ways that people of color and poor people around the world bear the brunt of the environmental realities that are not of their own creation is in fact loving. It is non-Christian to create those circumstances. And they are primarily delineated based on race. And so that's why it fits into the beloved community movement specifically. And it has, you can really pull apart the fourfold path that Larry went through when talking about creation, telling the truth. The Episcopal Church has a lot of truth to tell about how it came to own the land that it owns, who built the buildings literally with their hands that are actually on the land that the Episcopal Church owns. And walking through all the steps, I want to specifically talk about repairing the breach, because environmental racism is codified. That's what it is. It's racism that is codified in environmental law and policy. And if we lift up repairing the breach as part of becoming beloved community, and we lift up creation care as part of our call, then we need to be focusing on how to work against environmental policies that harm people. And there is a long legacy of racist policy in this country that has ongoing environmental effects for people of color. I know we have limited time, so I won't go into them all now, but I want to lift up one more very important point. It is actually, to me, and in the formation conversations that we have in our diocese, at least, not just about pollution, health, clean water, and those things are all critically important, and they're all critically important, so please hear that. But another piece to me that I think we need to remember is about access and the ability to have relationship with creation. Who controls creation? Who has green space in the places where they live? Who feels safe being out in creation and is able to experience the wonder that that God made for all of us, not just for one section of the population. So actually, just since we've been on the phone, I started thinking maybe creation care isn't exactly the right term we need to be using. Maybe it's creation relationship or something like that, that really encompasses the two pieces of that. Not forgetting that a relationship with God through creation is something that we are also called to have through our faith.
Good stuff. So while we're on the topic of religion and talking about the Episcopal Church and other denominations, let me get your opinions, and I'll open this up to the panel in terms of do we feel like the religious community is doing enough to work towards better communication, unity, racial healing? And if so, what do you see that is being done that is positive? And what are the things that you're not seeing done that absolutely need to be done from the religious community in this particular conversation we're having? So I'll open that up to anyone.
Anyone, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can start from the perspective of the Episcopal Church. We are taking on something that's very monumental within the church. And it's something that has started from our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, and it rolls down into the many dioceses, including the Diocese of Southern Ohio, within which we are located. The job of telling truth, proclaiming the dream, practicing the way, and repairing the breach is something that is very repetitive in our engagements within the church. We follow that up through the efforts of the leadership team and all of our action committees throughout the diocese by placing ownership and steering and driving this movement primarily in the hands of our white parishioners. This goes back to, I believe it was, can't remember whether it was Dr. Shahid or Dr. Gaynor, talking about that the work is not the work of one group of oppressed and underserved, it's the work of all of us. But in our minds, in becoming a beloved community, the heavy lifting has to be done by the persons with privilege and the persons that make decisions and drive our economy and drive our organizational and operational modalities. It needs to be there, and those are the people that need to be driving it. People of color need to be there also as allies, providing insights, observation, and holding those same people accountable for the work that they do. We think that's a big part of what we're trying to do in becoming a beloved community and in the Episcopal Church. We also begin by reorganizing, recognizing and acknowledging our role as a church in birthing and sustaining the sin of racism, while being careful not to assign blame or create an embarrassing situation with those who are sitting with us and working with us inside the room. It's not about any one individual. We know that you're not the people that did all these bad things during the war and after the war with Reconstruction. We know that you have nothing to do with that, but you are benefiting from that as a person, as a white person in our country. you are benefiting of that, whether you're against it or not. So if that's the case, we need to work together, and you need to be driving this train. I'll stop now and let folks chime in. I have a few other points, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Kevin, if you don't mind, before Dr. Shaheed and Dr. Gaynor pick this up, I want to add just briefly to Larry's point, which is your question. One of the questions I heard was, are we doing enough? Now, I can only speak for the Episcopal Church. It's the only church I've ever been part of, but in my opinion, we will not be doing enough until every person that holds a position of power is engaging every person in their diocese and congregation to engage in these really difficult conversations, to move this work forward. It will not be enough until we get to that point. It's not enough, to your point at the beginning, that we have a presiding bishop that's a man of color. It doesn't. It's a wonderful step, and we've taken some really important steps, and we continue to move forward. But gosh, sometimes it feels like things move really slowly. So no.
Dr. Shaheed, Dr. Gaynor, you all have any thoughts on this particular topic?
Just a couple. I think it is important for all religious and non-religious organizations, but talking about religious organizations specifically, to recognize the ways in which evangelizing communities has been weaponized, and that a part of the truth that needs to be told is the ways in which religion has played an active role in that. How many people's connection to spirit and to faith has been severed by a repairing, by a breach.
Dr. Shaheed, I don't think we're hearing you.
Yeah, I think we lost her audio there. Not sure what happened there. So hopefully we can get Dr. Shaheed's audio restored and fixed there. In the meantime, we'll move on. Dr. Gaynor, did you have any thoughts on this particular topic?
I think I'm going to stay away from the religion conversation, but I would like to add, Larry kind of talked about, having conversations and not putting blame on any particular people, but recognizing that you are benefiting from these systems that were created by your ancestors. And I also think, in addition to that, it's really important to recognize if you are not actively doing anything to work against systems of oppression, then you are very much complicit in maintaining those systems. And so I think that would be the only thing that I would want to add to this part of the conversation.
So, Dr. Gaynor, you raise a good point, and I hear this sometimes in my role as the opinion editor at the Inquirer feedback I get from readers. How do you talk to someone who feels like, someone who may say, you say I'm a white person who says, you say I may be benefiting from this system, but I certainly don't feel like I'm benefiting. I'm unemployed. I can't find a job. Don't have enough money for my kids to even go to school. I've got medical issues I can't pay for. Sure as heck doesn't seem like I'm benefiting from any system. I'm struggling, in fact, more than most, and I may be looking at some people of color who are doing far better than I am, and I'm saying, what are they complaining about? How do you address that individual who has that sort of mind frame, and it's difficult to convince them that they are somehow benefiting from this invisible privilege that they don't see showing up in their life as far as their experience is concerned? So
when I talk about privilege, I often articulate it as if it's a wind at one's back, right? And so when you're running a race and the wind is blowing in your back and it's helping you move faster in that race, you don't necessarily know that that wind is blowing you further. It's only until you turn around and face the wind that you could feel that adversity coming to you, right? The other thing that I articulate when I'm talking about privilege is, I'm talking about the fact that privilege or having privilege doesn't mean that someone doesn't have a hard time. It doesn't mean that someone doesn't have to work hard to achieve whatever it is that they have to achieve. It just means that your racial identity is not a barrier or an obstacle that you have to overcome to achieve those things. And those are the ways in which I articulate privilege. I would also ask them questions like, are you afraid that you're going to be killed if you get pulled over for speeding? Well, if not, that's an example of the privileges that you benefit from being a white person in this country.
Thank you so much. Dr. Shaheed, do we have your audio back in order yet?
Am I clear? Can you hear me?
We can
Yes.
hear you
I don't know
now.
what was happening. I was like, that must have been the enemy trying to make sure that I didn't get my 2 cents added.
No doubt. So I want you to go ahead and finish your point that you had started to make, and if there's anything you want to say on that last piece, I just kind of added in as well. So you have the floor.
Yes, my whole computer just went low. Can you all still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Now we can hear you. As soon as you started talking, it went out again.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear
Yes.
you now.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know what is happening right now. I would second everything that Dr. Gaynor just said, in terms of the ways in which to articulate privilege, and to help people think about how it is, that they're experiencing life and how they have access to energy, right? Energy sometimes is fiscal and economic, but energy, can also be natural resources. Energy is relationships, energy, and capacity to experience creation and to be thought of as being responsible for creation, right? Which gets back into some of the comments that I was making earlier about the ways that religion has been weaponized, and we haven't done enough to heal the truth about how we connect with spirit. And the ways in which many of our religious organizations were weaponized to support oppression and continue to be weaponized. And so to make a shift to now be responsible for healing without acknowledging how you were responsible for oppression is performative and can be performative. And so I think we've got to be very careful about the ways in which we tell our truths and how we access new truths. As we are creating something that's different so that we just don't repeat the same processes, but in ways that feel more comfortable to us, right? We may be uncomfortable with oppression, so we want to do something different, but still do it under the same guides. It's not getting us away from any of the practices that are already in place. And so I think there is much work to be done at religious universities and schools, as well as, several community organizations to free people's capacity to experience faith and spirituality in different ways, but to also to engage in multiple truths that many have been safeguarded under the auspices of religion, right? That we don't think or talk or say these things because of who we are and the God that we serve, and not acknowledging, the complicated nature of that. I think there's much great work and great opportunity to be done there.
Thank you, Doctor.
If you don't
Larry.
mind, I would love to build on what Dr. Shaheed just said.
Please.
Because I think the front part of my comments really talked about the positives that are going on in the church and how we're focused on setting things right. But I think it's also incredibly important for us to acknowledge when things were not done right, and they had a terrible effect on our communities and our country. Most of the church's explicit work against inclusion and unity occurred in the years immediately prior to and after the Civil War, during Reconstruction. The Episcopal Church in particular was very prominent in that regard. This is where an example of this is that the Episcopal Church during the period of Reconstruction and prior to the war was the only major denomination that did not take a stand against slavery, the only one. And after the war, the church was even openly vocal in our belief that those who were not white were inferior to those who were. And we also came out strongly, the church, not me, came out strongly in favor of segregation and practices nationally with a deeper emphasis in our churches in the South. So some of these examples include Black parishes, historically Black parishes in the Episcopal Church, who are being barred from participating in diocesan and national church affairs. Southern dioceses restricting Black representation and the mixing of races in local congregations. And finally, I'm sure there are many more, but these are the things that I particularly wanted to bring out. Participated in theological and biblical interpretation that was infused with messages of Black inferiority and spiritual benefits of servitude. That's the weaponization that Dr. Shahid is talking about. And the Episcopal Church was very, very prominent in that role, as well as some of the other churches of the day. So in order for us to move forward, we have to acknowledge our sins, and we have to build to set things right. So thanks for letting me get that.
No, thank you for that, Larry. That's a very important point, and I think that's a big part of any of our faiths who call us Christians is confessing our sins and acknowledging the wrongs that we've done, in addition to trying to make them right. So thank you for that. We're nearing close to the end of our time, and there are a few more areas that I want to cover, and then I want to get to some of the questions that I've seen pop up in the chat from some of our viewers. Dr. Shahid, I want to bring you back in. I want to talk about racial trauma and what that is and how that shows up and how that keeps us from getting to that point of healing in our country. So if you could just sort of give me your perspective on your thoughts on exactly what the definition of racial trauma is as you see it, and how does that show up in the lives of everyday folks? And how does that keep us from getting to that point of healing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a loaded question. I'll try to be very quick. Racial trauma for me, describes the many ways in which the truth of who we are as human beings has been disrupted by practices of oppression, by beliefs that disrupt our ability and capacity to fully stand in who we are, and to access a higher knowledge of who we are. Trauma, includes events that have happened. It includes things that we have inherited through our bloodline, things that we have inherited through our knowledge bases, the texts that we pass down, the things that we teach one another, the ways in which we learn what is acceptable and what is not. Trauma includes relationships and the ways that we engage and do not engage and relate with one another. Trauma, shows up in various ways, from the food that we eat, the relationships that we create, the ways that we pray, the fact that we pray. It impacts all areas of human activity. And so when we talk about racial trauma, it's this sort of break in, the move of energy, the shift in energy that we can experience as human beings. But it's also, for me, also speaks to sort of that critical point where we are broken open, right? Like trauma is where the wound happens. It's also where the light enters us, right? So it is in those spaces where we see where conflict is, or where something is going on, or we're experiencing something that's not aligning with our true or higher self. So much so we are called to, or compelled most often, to think about how we do something different. And so I think that there's a slew of great literature that is available right now, resources that help people think about that. I've been particularly fond of Resmaa Menakem's work, In My Grandmother's Hands, and the way that he provides knowledge for us to understand the way trauma impacts our body, and the way it shows up physically, and how we have to do, intentional work to make sure that we as individuals and as a collective have critical incubators to practice, to repetitively practice things that allow us to not only move that energy throughout our body, right? And so you get pulled over by the police and you feel that in your neck or in your chest, or, in your lower back. You carry that energy with you. What do you do to shift and move that racial trauma? You see someone, being hung. You see, these images over and over. You watch these police recordings. What does that do to your understanding of self and your understanding of other people? And if it's okay, right, how you engage. So how do we create practices that allow us to not only acknowledge that trauma exists, but to think about what we do to transform that energy, right? So that it doesn't stay negative. Because energy is never, created nor destroyed, right? It passes. And so if we have that, if we recognize that it's there, what can we do to create something new and transformative and healing with that? Those are the things that come to mind when I think about racial trauma.
Great. Dr. Gaynor, I'd like to bring you back in on this particular question and get your perspective.
Dr. Shaheed did an excellent job. I was taking notes as she was speaking, and thinking about the repeated bombardment, being bombarded by racially traumatic images and videos. We live in this society where everything is so instant and everything is so available. And in many ways, that is traumatic because we are taking in quite literally the killing of our own people, right? And so what does that do? I was just reading a piece of research that talked about, a young boy that was called to the principal's office, and he walked into the principal's office with his hands up, right? I mean, this is racial trauma. We're talking about children who aren't allowed to be children. They have to grow up very fast because of the world that they live in, because of the images and the things that they see on television, because of the fear that they or their parents might be killed because of any given situation, or might not be treated fairly because of any given situation, right? Dr. Shaheed earlier in our conversation talked about imagination, right? And so, when we think about the burden of racial trauma, it also impacts our ability to imagine our own future, to imagine what we can do, what's accessible to us, what opportunities we have. All of these things are limited, and they take a real toll on our bodies, on our mental well-being, on our physical well-being. I mean, there's research that talks about how racial trauma maps to our DNA. There's research that talks about how that racial trauma is passed down from generation to generation. And so these are the things that, communities of color and communities that experience marginalization and oppression are managing every day, all day, in the most mundane situations.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gaynor. So I want to toss out this final question that I have, and then I'm going to, again, go back to some of the things that I've seen in the chat from some of the viewers. And I'd like each of you to take on this particular question and give me your perspective. What does racial transformation in the United States look like for you? And how do we begin to work towards that and build greater unity among diverse and respective communities? So how do we build that unity and work towards that? And then what does that transformation look like to each of you? Catherine, I'll let you take the first crack at that.
That is a very difficult question, I think, from my perspective, so I will give it my best attempt. And here's why I find it to be so difficult. I don't actually feel like I can design out of my imagination what a world that lifts up people who have not had their voices heard look like. I feel more comfortable asking those people what the world should look like for them. What do I know what people who have not been heard would like from their lives? I don't know, and I want to be open to what other people speak into that, the wisdom that they have to speak. But I mean, in a general sense, it feels so massive to say it, but the undoing of racist policy, equality in our healthcare system, in our housing system, in basically any system that I could churn out, that where we're not currently seeing people being treated equally. I mean, but I think I'm going to stop, actually. I think that's all I have to offer into this space for now. And I'm going to mute myself and listen to what the rest of the panel has to say.
All right. Larry, what's your perspective on transformation? What does that look like?
God, I was hoping you wouldn't ask me next. It is a difficult question, but I sound like a broken record when I do this. The transformation happens when we take the Word of God and the teachings of Jesus out the door with us on Sunday morning. And it informs and it influences everything that we do and how we do it. Transformation is cultural, so it colors and it flavors how we do what we do. It's not just adding another thing to do, it changes how we do what we do. And for me, and I'm not ordained and I'm not a preacher or a priest, but for me is doing what you say you're going to do on Sunday morning. It really is as simple as that. Because if you're doing that, you're loving your neighbor, you're caring for those who cannot care for themselves, and you're dealing with everything with a sense of equity for everyone that you encounter in your day, in your life. That's what transformation means for me.
All right. Dr. Shahid?
Okay. Oppression says you can't exist without me, right? Community, from an Afrocentric, perspective says, I am because we are, right? Like we are interrelated, but we don't have to be interrelated because I have to control you. So transformation looks like the release of control of one community or one person over the other. It looks like the end of the prison system here. It looks like actual reparation to many communities who have been displaced so that the US can look the way it looks now, right? Both looking at both our indigenous communities as well as, our African-American communities and other communities of color. Racial repair and transformation looks like the undoing of policies that legitimize oppression as equality, right? And so looking at the redoing of the 1954 decision, right? That schools were never made equitable, right? It just said, you can't exist without me. You must go to school with me and watch me advance because I need you here, right? And so it looks like the undoing of those practices. Racial healing and transformation looks like, communities being able to exist in a multitude of ways, that there can be choice and access. It looks like the repair and acknowledgement of murder, both individual and collective murder, right? We've watched several videos and we'll see more biopics come out, about, oh my gosh, we actually now want to admit that we actually did throw bombs in Tulsa and we're sorry about it. It doesn't look like a video, right? It looks like the actual repair to those communities who have been, greatly impacted by racial trauma, Wilmington, Detroit. It looks like the undoing of gentrification and the giving people back of their land, time, space, energy, and resources so that they can exist on their own. It looks like the undoing of charity and philanthropy, so that we no longer have those communities that need us to come in and be saviors, but that everybody has the capacity to both create their own food, create their own existence, influence those things, and have equitable access to do that in ways that's not based upon what they had access before. That's what it looks like to me.
Thank you for that. Dr. Gaynor.
And so I think the umbrella that all of this falls under is dismantling white supremacist systems, white supremacist institutions, right? Transformation looks like transformation looks like all people being able to live freely and authentically in their own spaces, in their own skin, arriving as they want to arrive. It means dismantling economic violence, racial violence, exploitation, capitalism. It means engaging in meaningful, not performative gestures, meaningful work, actual action. You know, we have a lot of conversations, and conversations are wonderful. And I think conversations are a great foundation, but conversations without translating into action is meaningless and has absolutely no impact. And quite frankly, there are many people who are tired of being a part of conversations because they recognize that these conversations don't go anywhere.
Mhm.
And so actually meaning what you say and doing what you say, right? So not performative. You know, I have some amazing undergraduate students who are working with me in the Center for Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, Akua Wilson and Lonnie Jennings, and they've created a radical empathy training. And one of the things that they challenge their trainees to do, I want to offer this challenge to the people who are here watching this session, is to create a personal mission statement, right? So what will you do at a fundamental level? And it doesn't necessarily have to be grand, right? But what actions will you consistently engage in that can transform white supremacist systems and fight against racism? If everybody can craft a mission statement, and if everybody can implement that mission statement over the course of their life, just imagine what we could actually look like as a country.
You know, that's great. That's great commentary right there. And it actually was going to lead me into one of the comments or questions that one of our viewers on the chat had. And maybe you can offer up something, or others on the panel. You talk about that mission statement, performative actions that people can take. What if I'm somebody listening to this and I want to do exactly what you said, but I have no clue what to do? Like, what are some simple things or some suggestions that you know from your experience or what others have done, that suggestions that you could give to regular everyday people of something that they could do to go out and fight against oppression and overturn some of these systems that we've been talking about tonight?
Yeah, the first thing that I would offer is to educate yourself. Well-meaning people and well-intentioned people often cause harm. And so it's important to understand and to be educated about what the issues are, about what your narratives are, and how you approach issues and people when you are in these spaces, right? So the first thing that I would say was educate yourself. There are a ton of books out there that talk about issues related to racial healing, that talk about issues related to race and racism, economic violence, housing policy. I mean, there's just a wealth of knowledge out there. So I would say start there. And once you have educated yourself, I think there are a number of things that you can do. One of them is, you know, learn what others' experiences are. You might not have this lived experience. What are others' lived experience? And connect to those lived experiences. Be in those communities actively in a meaningful way. And a very simple thing you could do is challenge the folks who are sitting around your table Sunday afternoon for dinner, or Thanksgiving, or when they make that racist joke, right? That's not funny, but you chuck it off because, oh, that's just Uncle Bobby over there being himself, right? Challenge those people when they say those things. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with folks, and I'm like, white people need to talk to white people, right? Because that is critically important. There are conversations that I can't have, right? Or there are things that I could say that would be received in a very different way. So I would say at a very fundamental level, you can educate yourself, you can get proximate to the issue, right? And understand the lived experiences that you don't have access to, and then challenge where you can within your spheres of influence.
Larry, Catherine, what can church folk do? What can everyday?
Well, Dr. Gaynor mentioned something that is actually critically part of the Beloved Community Movement, and that is we call it story sharing, but I think her point was more like story hearing. listen to the stories of other people, understand their experience, believe the truth that they tell when they tell it is the actual truth, even though you don't necessarily understand it. I meant to say when talking about the beloved community movement earlier, that it is framed in the Episcopal Church, but the principles exist in the secular world, or they can, and they should, and they do. So, I mean, hear what other people are saying. Share, I mean, I think share your perspective. And I would also say, don't be afraid to, well, I was going to say, don't be afraid to screw up, but that's sort of not what I meant, actually. I think fear is probably a fairly natural part of the process for anybody who is in the place that you mentioned, where they want to do something but don't quite know what. Embrace it and don't let fear be the thing that stops you. Because that's it. And Larry, you unmuted, so I think you probably had something to add to that as well.
Oh, yes, thank you, Catherine. Not much of what's been said. I believe that education is important, and then courage. One of the questions talked about racial healing circles, and that's very interesting because we have a lot of circles, Zoom call circles, weekly within the Becoming Beloved Community movement, and those circles are attended by primarily white people. People of color are definitely in the minority within our movement, and that's the way it should be. But what's most important to me is that I want the people that I'm sitting around Zoom wise and saying the things that I want them to say, and being one with us in terms of what is right, to be courageous enough to go out and take that conversation into your world, into your environments, where you're going to hear things that aren't right, and they aren't right. Complicity is a very, very comfortable place to be when you're a privileged individual. And I don't want you to be comfortable. I want my white brothers and sisters to step into discomfort and challenge the things that they're seeing and hearing. We can't move forward to become the world that we wish for until we're able to do that. I think that's all I have.
Thank you, Larry. Dr. Shaheed will give you the final word on this segment.
Yeah, I just want to say right on to what my colleagues have said, but particularly Dr. Gaynor. But I want to redirect, I think, some of the things that she said so that folks who are listening, who may not be white, who are thinking those comments only apply to them, that's not the case. Folks are also asking, like, what can I do? I want to get out there. This has happened, and I want to, hit the ground running. And I always tell people, don't run out, run in, turn inward, and bless people with your overflow. Right. And what I mean by that is internalized racism is also real. And so you want to make sure that you are doing your work internally and within your spheres of influence so that when you come to the table, you come to the table whole so that you can reimagine and take on a different position. There is nothing more unfortunate than getting to a table of well-meaning folks, Black, brown, white, green, cream, and they've not done their work. What we all end up doing is performing those roles that we know to perform, whether they are that of the oppressed or the oppressor. And so when you're asking what you can do, the real work is to go inward so that, again, you can bless from your overflow, so that your cup is full in a different way, so that when you engage the other, whether your other happens to look exactly like you or your other is of a different race or creed or gender or whatever it is, you can engage them from a place of wholeness. What oppression does, what racism does is keeps us broken. And it's easy to look at the other's brokenness and say, well, what can I do to help you? But to really look at the impact on yourself first is essential, so that we can do what we've been talking about earlier in terms of being able to imagine, being able to create, but also being able to engage one another and not cause more harm, right? I heard one of you say, hurt people hurt people. And so you've got to work on healing yourself first so that you don't pass your guilt around, pass your internalized oppression or internalized racism around. You want to go out whole. So before you go out to others, make sure that you go inward. And then, start with your family, your unit, and then watch that thing automatically manifest itself. You won't need to go out. You'll begin to feel out. You'll begin to just fall over in ways where you won't need to look for the work or for the transformation. It will manifest on its own.
And if I could just add just very, very quickly, the other thing is when you're doing your work, don't put the burden on people of color.
All right. Well, I think that's a good spot for us to end this discussion on. This has been a great conversation, a great panel. You guys brought some great wisdom, perspective, and some actual things that we can take away from this and put into action into our lives, which is very important. We don't just want to talk about it. We want to be able to go out and begin to make a difference. And I think you all have helped us do that here today. So thank you for your time and for your contribution to this very important conversation. So at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, who I guess is going to take us home.
Thank you, Kevin. I definitely most certainly want to thank the Center for Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation for their partnership in this program. Want to thank Gallagher Insurance once again for their sponsorship towards this series as well. And then I want to thank you, Kevin, for moderating this outstanding discussion, along with our remarkable panel, Catherine, Larry, Dr. Shaheed, and Dr. Gaynor. Thank you for lending your time, your perspective, and I know that your works as well. We are here talking heads right now, but there's a lot of work that's being done. In my closing remarks, I will say a unified community is a healthy community, a community that embraces differences and the mosaic of the human spirit. We're not all monolithic. We are going to show up as our authentic selves, and we need to be willing to embrace each other. This past weekend, since I have people on the panel as well as maybe attending from the faith-based community, and there was a sermon that I heard this weekend, which I'm going to liberate a little bit of what was shared. And it was around the idea of geese, and that geese fly farther than eagles. And the reason why geese fly further than eagles are because they have a sense of community. Think about it. Have you ever seen a flock of eagles? No, because they operate on an individual basis. I constantly here in Cincinnati, I run into these geese and they're always together, either 6, 10, 15, 20 deep. Nature has a way of telling us and communicating to us. And so the reason why they fly further than eagles is because when they take flight, they fly together. And when who's ever at the front gets tired, there's a shift within the formation to where the one in the back then takes the lead. And so they're not doing this alone, they are doing it together. And so I want to encourage all of you to understand that in order for any transformation, any healing to take place, any semblance of unity, we have to have that spirit of the geese and what they have in building our community, working together. And so I want to thank all of you for attending. And once again, thank this wonderful panel. Please continue to look upon the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center as a resource, as an educational resource, as a community uplifting resource, not only for the great city of Cincinnati, but for our nation. Thank you for joining us, and all of you have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you.